that is still very much having effects today. I will talk about how the city is gendered, talking about public spaces as contested territory, and then finish with a couple of remarks about Hannah Arendt. The ideology of the two spheres, that is really a 19th century thing. It's explicitly a 19th century thing. John Ruskin has this quotation from Sesame and Lilies is used a lot to illustrate what it means, the ideology of the two spheres. It's the ideology in which cultures seem to think that there is a world of men and a world of women, and that women and men are very, very different. So for Ruskin, the man's power is active, progressive, defensive. He is eminently the doer, the creator, the discoverer, the defender. Woman's power is for rule, not for battle. Her intellect is not for invention or creation, but for sweet ordering, arrangement, and decision. The man in his rough work in open world must encounter all peril and trial, but he guards the woman from all this within his house as ruled by her. Need enter no danger, no temptation, no cause of error or offense. This is the true nature of home, is a place of peace. We could, sentence per sentence, start deconstructing this and criticizing this, and it's in many ways utter nonsense. But being utter nonsense, it still has lasting effects on how we conduct our lives today. In the 19th century, with historical distance, it's easier for us to see how that worked and how that had an effect on the life, mainly of women. As you know, women could not go out in the streets, for example, on their own, or at least women of a certain class, bourgeois women, could not do that. Working class women always have been forced to be out on their own. So if you wanted to be respectable, you needed to be accompanied by a male of your family, or by a maid at least, or another woman in going out in the 19th century. Of course, also access to universities and libraries and pubs and parliament buildings and so on, all was limited for women. Up till very long, as you know, in Belgium we only had general vote in 1948, so that's not that long ago. Still today, or at least in my generation, and I think you know what a public woman is? Also the younger generation, you know what it is? Okay, it doesn't work anymore these days. In my generation, public women were prostitutes. Yeah? The problem is that public men, men are public. There is nothing prostitute about a man who is public. But a woman who is public is a prostitute. That was in many languages like that, also in Flemish, in Dutch. Nowadays, well, maybe we should be happy that it's not anymore the case. But yeah, well, you can find nice images about this 19th century arrangements of public and private sphere. The private sphere was the sphere of women. Public sphere was the sphere where men could go about. Women in much more limited consent. It also means, for example, and Janet Woos talks about that in Feminine Sentences, that women artists were much more limited in the topics that they could work on, because they could not easily take their paints and go sit somewhere in a station or something, a railway station, and paint like the Impressionists were doing. So 19th century women had a lot of constraints. And these constraints, one can say, are in fact implicated in architecture. They are part of architecture. So you also have analysis, and a very good one of Mark Whitley, for example, that really says the house, the history of the house goes back to antiquity, to Greek culture, to Roman culture, if you go back that far. And if you read then, for example, the Renaissance treatises on architecture, like Alberti's treatise on architecture, you will find that the purpose of the house is to domesticate women. So that goes back to a culture in which paternity was difficult to be sure of. We are living, antiquity was patriarchal. We're still living in patriarchal societies. A big deal in patriarchal societies is that men need to be sure that the younger man they call their son is indeed their son, right? That's why women need to be domesticated, why you need the house, to put the woman in the house, and other men then cannot approach her. That's the whole idea of the house, it seems. Or at least that's one way of reading the history. And there is a lot of material that supports that vision. So also Ruskin saying his house as ruled by her, she is the mistress of the house, but she is also in many ways confined to the house. So the history of the house is the history of how women are positioned in a culture, and in art, for example, the art of Louise Bourgeois, and this is a drawing from 1947, also witnesses of this identification of house and woman. Woman and house, it's a very intimate relationship, let's say. Of course, feminist movements have reacted against these limitations. And one of the more important reactions is, for example, from Betty Friedan, The Feminine Mystique, dating back to 1963, and criticizing post-war, especially American culture, but in Europe it was very much similar, saying that the cult of domesticity, the domestic sphere, the women being homemakers, being the ones who really were responsible for decorating the house, for buying all the consumption goods. This was a way in which America has been able, especially the United States. A major challenge after the Second World War was to turn a war economy into a peace economy. That was really, really quite a challenge. And they managed to do that by transforming all the factories that produced weapons and tanks and so on, to transform them into factories producing consumer goods. So households were buying Levittown homes, suburban homes, and they were buying television sets, radio sets, fridges, washing machines, and you name it. That boom allowed the economy of the United States to make the transition rather smoothly, but it also meant, that was part of it, that women had to leave the factories, because during the war the men were in Europe fighting as soldiers after the Second World War, and the women were taking their place in the factories. So women had to get out of the factories, men back in the factories. And this whole system of women being the homemakers and the caretakers was very much pushed in the United States. So the cult of domesticity flared up again in post-war America, and Betty Friedan, in writing The Feminine Mystique, says there is really a problem with that. Women being confined to or not confined literally like they were in antiquity, but women being identified with the home creates this problem without a name, frustration, anxiety. Women need to emancipate themselves. So that's one of the reasons why we had the second wave of feminism in the 60s and the 70s, and then we have had a third wave in the 90s. So today we think we are emancipated. Many of us really are convinced that males and females are totally equal, that equality is also legally guaranteed, even on the European level that's guaranteed. And I think, maybe I should ask you, anyone here thinks that is not the case? Okay, good. But still, it's only 5 people out of, I don't know, 30 or 40 or so. So the majority idea is there is this equality. And if you say no equality, what do you say? Equivalency, or are you agreeing that men are superior and women are inferior?
I don't agree, but I think it's often still true.
Okay, okay.
I do not agree they're equal. I mean, they're equal, but they're different.
Okay, different but equal in value. Okay, but different, yes. So, even if we have this idea of equality or difference in equality, you see that this ideology of 2 spheres is very, very, very persistent in social reality. These are the figures of 2004. There are figures for more recent. I will show them a bit later. But this is typically the pattern that you have across Western countries. Flanders is no exception at all. What do you see? Men between 18 and 70 or something. A man on average spends 27 hours, almost 30 minutes on paid jobs, and women more than 10 hours less on average. And the reverse is true for the time people spend weekly on care. And care is all kinds of domestic chores. It's taking care of the kids. It's also taking care of yourself. Care is everything. So men, 13 hours, women 25 hours. So that is massive. That's really massive. It's simply not true that women are now in the labor force on the same footing as men are. It's not true. Women are working far less than men. Men are spending far less time than women on caring jobs. And this translates. I don't have point. I'm sorry. I should have taken it off. So it's here that you see that women have more dark blue, which is domestic chores and care work, and less light blue, and this is what men do. So it's more or less the total of work, you can argue, is more or less the same, although women work more than men if you take care work into account. But it's a little bit similar. Although in terms of free time, women do have less free time than men. So this is social reality. This is really on average. And it does mean, in my mind, that this ideology of the 2 spheres in which women are associated with home and caring for children and so on, that this is still very, very, very much part of social reality. It also, this ideology of the 2 spheres also lingers on in public space, in the spaces of our cities, our streets, our squares. I'm not sure about the internet, but I think you can make a similar argument about the internet. But I have looked here at physical public spaces, at, let's say, the classical public spaces. It seems very stupid, but some geographers have been doing it, counting the names of the streets and counting who is being depicted, who gets a sculpture, a statue in the city. Well, you can probably predict the outcome.
80%.
I think it's 90 to 95. So if streets are named for people, streets and squares, it's 90 to 95% men. Statues, the same. You do have this type of statues. So if you see women in the townscape, but if you see women, it's very often allegorical figures. Vrouw Justitia, Dame Justitia, or Lady of Liberty. So they are not specific women with a name and a clear identity and a historic significance. They are like these symbolic figures. Then women appear in public space, but not otherwise. So yeah, and I think also in our 21st century, even though we are supposedly equal and supposedly we have equal access to public space, there is still all these remnants. Also, I think for most of us, we still think, or we still are more careful, more cautious about what we say to our daughters when they go out and when they come home. We are much more anxious about what they will encounter in the streets. So make sure you're not alone. Don't make it too late. That neighborhood is really dangerous. Don't pass there. For daughters, we are much more. So public space is seen as more dangerous for women than for men. Although we also know, but that doesn't really enter in our consciousness so much, but we do know that the statistics of rape are such that rape offers much more at home and in places that you frequent interior spaces than it happens on the street. Nevertheless, we don't caution our daughters about uncles or other potentially dangerous rapists, but we do that when they go out in public space. So the idea that public space is so dangerous for women is still very much part of our understanding. The street names and the sculptures are already, and a very stupid thing, but nevertheless also very symptomatic, the toilet facilities. The toilet facilities, if you have a festival, if you have, but also the normal toilet facilities in cities, there are many more public toilets for men than for women. And in Ghent, I think they have had these actions around that. There's been some activism, especially with the Gentse feesten and how police is so, and so on. But this is also something to think about. So there are, of course, efforts to feminize this. People are aware, especially feminists are aware of this problem. So in Amsterdam you have a neighborhood from the 90s, I think, where you have a Rosa Luxemburgstraat and a Catharina van Tussenbroekstraat. So there is some kind of consciousness, there is some idea of turning it around. But we are still a far cry from equal representation of men and women in this kind of ways. Okay, so the ideology of the two spheres is still very much, maybe as on an ideological level, on a conscious level, it's not maybe so much with us, but in terms of impact, you can still point to so many things. Okay, gendering the city. This is more on the level of discourse and representation and associations. Maybe not incredibly important, but still I think as designers and as people working in public space, it's good to be aware of these things. So that's why I'm pointing them out. In terms of gendering, you have different ways of gendering the city. It's not a kind of very pertinent baseline story. No, there are many different ways of looking at the city in terms of gender. From this perspective, which is one that maybe historically was more used than today, but still, historically you do find a lot of discourses that represent the city as the locus of civilization versus nature as wilderness. And if that is the opposition, civilization versus wilderness, then of course the civilization is gendered masculine and the wilderness is gendered feminine. Because, well, in our culture, not only in our culture, in a lot of cultures, women are seen as more closely to nature. Nature also has this this characteristics of being at the same time attractive and threatening. Being attractive and threatening, that's feminine. So these are fertility, of course. This is something you easily find. And that opposition was in the post-war period reproduced in the sense that the city was a space for work, the city center, with the skyscrapers, and this is especially true for North America, but it was to a large extent also valid here, whereas the suburbs, or for us the verkavelingen, were more seen as the spaces of the family and hence of women. And in a certain sense, the architectural forms also answers to that logic, in the sense that the phallic symbols of the skyscrapers, you find them in the city center, and the more curvilinear forms, the undulating forms, which supposedly rather refer to the female body, that is a pattern that you would find in the suburbs in America. Or think about a book like Delirious New York of Rem Koolhaas, analyzing the downtown athletic club skyscraper as a machine for producing metropolitan bachelors. For example, the bachelors eating oysters naked with boxing gloves. That's a famous drawing representing this bachelor culture, metropolitan culture, that Koolhaas is glorifying in Delirious New York, versus the representation of the suburbs and the shopping centers, where of course the home identified with the woman, the shopping centers also identified with women, and where which is seen then more as the realm of women. Again, this is the 50s, late 40s, beginning 50s, so you might expect that it's now a little bit different, but that is where we come from. These are the historical associations that go with our spatial patterns, and it's not completely over and done with, I would argue. Okay, I said that looking at the city from a gender perspective is never a kind of one-layered story, a baseline story. There is also a whole discourse that rather genders the city feminine. So it's also in German, for example, die Stadt is feminine. In French, la ville, it's feminine. So there is also a whole literature and a whole history of tradition of representation that represents the city as labyrinth, compelling, inviting, fascinating, enigmatic, seductive. That looks at the city from as representing the figure of woman and the feminine. Where, and that's also very much there in, for example, colonial discourse, the discourse on cities like Cairo or Casablanca or Algiers. The city as a labyrinth that can be explored and penetrated and conquered. So it usually goes together, this understanding of the city as enigmatic and seductive with the desire to explore, to penetrate, to conquer, especially in colonial literature, colonial discourse. And the literature of modernity abounds with that type of description. For example, Walter Benjamin's famous Arcades books, where he glorifies the 19th century flaneur, where he really is writing in a very seductive way also about erring through the city, about sensing the city, sounding the city. Of course, he identifies there with the male flaneur. There were in the 19th century no female flaneurs. So modernity and the literature on modernity has been focusing very much on this type of experience, which was gendered. And of course also that kind of runs parallel with another tradition in Western history and elsewhere, but especially in Western history. That is that the distribution of the visuality of the visual regime has been uneven. This kind of distribution, where the man is in the subject position and the woman is in the object position, is very, very typical, of course. This is 1527. It's very often, still today, in courses of drawing, this image is used to explain the use of perspective. Usually, teachers do not point out that it's no coincidence that this is a man and this is a woman. But if you have learned about the dominance of the gaze in that direction and the absence of the gaze in that direction, then yeah, you cannot but be struck by this. And there is a way of understanding the whole discipline of planning as a way, and also there you can very easily find the metaphors to support that analysis. That planning, for example, Haussmann's plan for Paris, with all the boulevards, and you know these famous drawings, representations of that. That Haussmann was describing Paris indeed as a body, a female body that was ill. The urban body was female, the prostitutes were symptomatic for the overall illness of the urban body, and by doing these interventions of all these boulevards, the body of the city would become healthy again. So there is a kind of logic imposing control, order, logic upon the female body of the city. So in a sense, kind of disciplining that female body. And people have argued that the very same can be said of Le Corbusier with his Plan Voisin for Paris. Also in his discourse, it's not difficult to find these gendered metaphors and to see his plans, his urban plans, as a way of masculine logic taking over from the feminine body, or disciplining the feminine body of the city. I think it's more easy to see this kind of things in hindsight. It's more difficult to find them, and people are nowadays also a bit more prudent in how they speak, and these gendered metaphors are not really completely gone from our conversations, but they are far less present than they used to be. Nevertheless, what I really want you to take from this, if you maybe don't want to take the overall perspective, but what you do need to take from this is that public space is contested territory. It's not the same for everyone. And people are not all people feel the same, feel in the same way about their presence in public space. Sometimes this female inferiority in public space can be exploited. And a very famous example of that was the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires. You know that story? No, most of you are too young to know that story. So there was a military regime, a dictatorship in Argentina, and they made people disappear. That was one of the ways to discipline the people, that if you were too critical, you simply disappeared. And they were, of course, very heavy-handed against demonstrations. But these are the mothers of children, sons and daughters who disappeared, and they managed to set up a system of demonstrating around this is the May Pyramid, a central symbol of political power in Buenos Aires. They were women of a certain age, my age I think. In Latin American culture, in Argentinian culture, this type of women becomes rather invisible because they are no longer sexually attractive. So they can go about public space, not attracting too much attention. And they could, in groups of 2 or 3, because there was, you could not demonstrate with large groups, but of course women of a certain age in groups of 2 or 3, they could walk around the May Pyramid. And they identified by wearing these white kerchiefs. And by the time that the authorities understood what was happening, that you had more and more of these women and that it really was becoming very obvious that this was a demonstration, by that time journalists, from international journalists had already found out, were writing about these women, and in fact it said that it's thanks to them that in '83 the military regime broke down. So there is also a way of exploiting a subaltern position. It's Susana Torre who has made this analysis. So by playing upon their subaltern roles, she claims mothers succeeded where more open resistance could not. So this way of using subaltern positions in order to subvert the existing dominance can maybe be inspirational. This you probably should also come as no surprise to you, but still the figures are... how do women have to be naked to get into the Metropolitan Museum? Yes. Well, as artists, they do not get there. I think today these figures are slightly better, but I don't think we are at 10%. This was an advertisement from the 80s, from the Guerrilla Girls. And of course, the nudes are mostly female. So in the public space that is the museum, women are not equally present. And yeah, I was telling you, public space is contested territory. So we do have all these initiatives to make public space more safer for women, like for example having specific parking places for women. But then you also have, and I was just looking on the internet to find images, and you also have, of course, this type of supposedly joke dance. This is an article about a serious scientific research that finds out that women do park better than men, but the illustration is this. Yeah. So sexism still is all around, of course, but for me that's an example of how public space is contested. On the one hand, women claim we need to have a part of public space that is really made safe for us. On the other hand, men will joke about it and will not accept it, and so there is struggle going on. I'm not sure whether I'm so really happy with this phenomenon of the female-only spaces, but it's there. It's to tell you it is contested. Or this, the slut walks. You're familiar with the slut walks? Recent phenomenon. I think very rightfully so that women should demonstrate. I think this is absolutely true. The way big girls dress doesn't create rapists. It's absolutely true. We also have the slut walk in Amsterdam, so it's not just North America. And we had, you remember the people from Belgium, Femme de la Rue? Yeah. So Femme de la Rue is a film made by Sophie Peters a couple of years ago about her experiences as a young woman who lives in Brussels and who cannot go out simply during the day. All times she cannot go out without being harassed and without getting comments and without really feeling not at ease. she is obliged to really think through, what shall I wear? Shall I really, this dress of mine, is it not too short? And so on and so on. And she documents that in this film Femme de la Rue. It almost sounds like a femme publique, which I think it's a wordplay on this idea of the public women, and this in fact lingering effects of the ideology of the two spheres that claims if you are as a woman out on the streets, it means that you are sexually available. That's a kind of lingering effect of the ideology of the two spheres, and that is what she was documenting. Of course, you can say this has to do with specific subcultures that are there, and that's why I find this cartoon very interesting. I'll give you a moment to read it. They are both convinced of what they are saying. But the thing is that really, in many different cultures, including the Western culture, women are not in a position of power, not even in a position of equality. Women are subaltern and are living in male-dominated cultures. Contested public space as contested territory. This is also found on the internet. In Japan, apparently, they have metro cars that are women only. My impression was that the rule is not really followed, but maybe that's also part of contested public space. Do I have a little bit of time? Because I wanted also to talk, but I don't have the right images here. But since Wim Embrechts has been talking about Molenbeek and Brussels, a doctoral student of mine has done a very small research. It was really very small, but the results were in my mind very telling. She asked 4 people to guide her through Molenbeek. She told them planning to come and live there, and she asked 4 different people to take an hour, 2 hours on a Saturday to show her around Molenbeek, just to make her familiar with that part of the city, because she was coming to live there. The 4 people she was doing this experiment with were 2 men and 2 women, and 2 people with a Belgian background and 2 people with a migrant background. Only 4 people, but the results were in fact confirming what we know from the literature. For example, the Belgian people were looking at Molenbeek and showing Molenbeek to her very much in the sense. Wim has been showing us an image of Molenbeek and Brussels and kind of intertwined. You remember that image? So for the Belgian people, Molenbeek was part of the Greater Brussels, and they showed her. They went across the canal and they showed her larger parts of the whole thing, and took her either by car or with a baker's bike. So they felt Molenbeek is part of metropolitan Brussels. The migrants, the people with a migrant background, rather showed her a much more limited space. They brought her to the canal but did not cross it. So they did not enter Brussels itself. They remained in Molenbeek. And their stories about what they saw around them and where she could find which shops and which people were living where and where you had which mosques and which communities were much more detailed than from the Belgian people. So that was the difference between Belgians and migrant people. On the other hand, there was also a clear difference between the men and the women. So men were showing her around as if they were owning public space almost. They were very much comfortable and at ease, and they really were crossing squares in the middle of the squares, not alongside the walls. So they had a sense of ownership over public space. also talking to a lot of people, whereas the women were much more using public space in order to get somewhere. So it were the women who showed her the shops. And for them, the facades were not like the walls of an enclosed place, but were transparent and were screens to go behind. And the women were the ones who knew where, for example, surprisingly large shop areas were behind rather new, like you have here in the Vennestraat. If you look not very closely, you would not expect that a space this large would be behind the facades here in the Vennestraat. It were the women who showed her that kind of things. So they were much more oriented towards the interior spaces behind the facade. So it's only 4 people, but the 4 people clearly had different experiences, different perceptions, different understandings of the same public space, and so had different narratives and different walks, different ways of showing it to her. But, and you can describe where the differences come from, and they are consistent with how men and women in the literature are said to experience urban space differently. And also it's not surprising that for the Belgian people, the whole gentrification process that's going on in Molenbeek was seen as a very positive thing, whereas for the migrant people, they felt threatened by that because it pushes out the affordable dwellings. Okay. And this then, now the last part is just a kind of afterthought. It does not really intertwine very well with what I have been talking up till now, but I thought I should tell you a little bit about that, because we have been working a bit on this idea, or I think it's relevant to at least know that in some discourses, like in Hannah Arendt's discourse, work and labor are not the same thing. Hannah Arendt was an important philosopher, German in origin, but she lived for a very long time also in New York. She was a student of Martin Heidegger, and she has mainly become famous because of books like Eichmann in Jerusalem and The Banality of Evil and Origins of Totalitarianism. I'm especially looking at the human condition, because in the human condition, she says that there are in fact 3 spheres or 3 different conditions, if you want, conditioning human activities. So see, she distinguishes between labor, work, and action. 3 different activities. Labor, according to her, has to do with everything that is necessary to maintain life. Producing, consuming, cooking, eating, doing domestic chores, but also economy at large, that is part of labor. Just what we need to be able to survive. Work is the word that she really has for everything that has to do with art and culture. So for her, and that has to do with worldliness, for her, labor is about a kind of necessary work, but not work that produces, let's say, cultural, durable artifacts. And work is intellectual work, artistic work, cultural work that is public, that has to do with the process of poiesis, with poetic thinking, with creativity, and that so there is for her a line between labor and work. And then action, the last type of activity, has to do with politics, with decision making, with civicness, with plurality. So there is really 3 spheres: economy, art and culture, and politics. And it's only when these 3 spheres are somehow balanced out that as a human being, your life is is a good life. It's a way. I think she bases this very much on antiquity, on ancient Greek culture. Now, of course, if you look at that, you can say two different things. One is that the three spheres are being dominated by man and masculine values. The economy, although it sounds like she is describing it, it sounds very much as a kind of household thing. But the economy, as we know it, and I did not yet read it, but I'm going to read this Catherine Marcel book, Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner? That's her very recent book, a story about women and economy. So in economics, starting with Adam Smith, it's thought that economic value is produced in a certain way. And since Adam Smith, economics really started, women's work and care work has never been part of economy. So everything women do at home is not seen as worth paying for, at least if they do it for their own family. So who cooked Adam Smith's dinner? In the examples that he uses in his book, apparently he talks about how there is a farmer and a butcher and a baker in his village, and that their work makes it possible for him to have his food and to eat, but he doesn't talk about his mother cooking his dinner. It was his mother in this case. So economy dominated by man and masculine values. Art we talked already about. Politics I don't think I need to show more than this one picture. So there is masculine dominance in the three spheres, and then the other problem that one can see nowadays, or already for a very long time, but now it's only more outspoken, that Hannah Arendt was already seeing herself, is that economy is taking dominance over the other spheres. Over art and culture, over politics, and this is one of the reasons you can, or the main reason maybe, why we are running into trouble with climate change and with all kinds of other things. So that's a way of using this thinking of Hannah Arendt to understand what is going on today. And if you go back to this, the labor and the work, I think what we have been talking about this morning is about how design somehow is in between originally, 20th century, Bauhaus, a Werkbund idea of design, somewhere in between here, collaboration between art and industry, that was the whole Werkbund idea. So using creativity to make labor and economy run smoother, that's where design was historically in between there. We have been talking also a bit, especially when questions came up, about how it then relates to politics. So I think in that sense it's maybe a fruitful way of organizing your thoughts. Hannah Arendt can maybe be helpful in that, to think about positioning design, participatory design, public space, and all the rest that we have been talking about. Thank you very much. Questions?
Maybe I've also more of a comment or a reflection. I think it's quite interesting that you had to give this lecture to shift the focus on gender in a way, and that I think that yesterday we thought a lot about work, but always the work that is visible outside, not so much of how people reproduce their lives and what might be happening inside, or what is invisible and undervalued. I think that's really interesting, and also to think of maybe to kind of catch on us as designers, that actually I think over the last days we've seen lots of references to male work, male white work. So I think it's also, where does our thinking come from? And when we think about design and engage with theory, I think very often we pick up male white writers rather than women or post-colonial writers. And I think there seems to be quite a lot that we can do also just to work on our own thinking and preferences. So that actually it would be quite nice to not need one lecture that about gender.
Yes, of course.
All intertwined.
Yeah. I have been involved with these gender studies things for 20 years or something, and that's something that I have heard again and again and again. This should not be necessary anymore, that we put it on the table as a separate topic. It should be part of the conversation automatically. But sadly it is not, so we need apparently to do this again and again and again to make people aware of this kind of implicit assumptions that we all share, and if we don't make them explicit, they are not on the table. But men and women share these silent assumptions that there is no problem anymore with emancipation, men and women are equal, and we don't need to talk about it, it's automatically. No, it's not automatically, it's far from automatically. And if we don't address it, then it simply remains under the table and unaddressed, and it certainly won't get better. So that's why we need to really talk about it. Yeah.
But just to connect with that in an analytic space, I think there was one quote that said like how can women realize their potential, and I think it's not, at least how I imagine it, it's not so much about us women realizing our potential, because that's what we need to do. I think it's also men will be changing once gender relations change. It's not just about women being, equal to men, but actually that things more generally change of how we relate to each other.
Yeah, but I think these patterns are really, really persistent, and one can wonder whether men would want to change. I heard a lecture very recently by Peter Blick, who is looking at masculinities and ideals of masculinity, and his main and he is in social psychology, sociology, more the social sciences, so he was familiar with a lot of different social research studies looking at this, also cross-cultural. And he says, and what I took from it was this: it's obviously in cross-culturally, men are in more powerful positions than women. So women are subordinate to men or subaltern. On the other hand, the values associated with femininity are in almost all cultures seen as superior to the values associated with femininity, like kindness, friendliness, being socially inclined, teamwork, that kind of thing, things associated with care, of course. That's very much seen as more valuable across cultures than masculine characteristics that have to do with dominance, being very decisive, being the leader. So he says that it seems paradoxical, but on the other hand, it seems that men benefit from being in the position, even if these characteristics of being a leader, being decisive, being very proactive, being sometimes even maybe dominant and oppressive, all these things are seen in general culturally not as very good things, but good in men. So men are valued and are really liked if they show these characteristics very much. And what makes it easy for men, he says, is that in their 3 different roles, it's the same type of characteristics that are expected from them. So in a work context, men need to be leaders. In a romantic context, women are selective, look up to older men, usually choose partners that are a couple of years older than they are, who are better earners. So men who are better earners, financially secure, are sexually more attractive than other men. And then in their role as fathers, they also need to be the person who is a little bit the one who engages discipline. So that's a very coherent role, whereas women in a work context, they would need to be decisive and leaders, but in a romantic context, they need to play the nice lady, and in a context of motherhood, they need to take on caring roles. So the women's roles are much more conflicting. I thought that a very interesting way of explaining why the persistence of this situation. Being feminine is seen as a very good thing and very worthwhile, but nevertheless, if you are a man, you are not brought very far by embracing feminine values or by trying to emulate feminine characteristics. So yeah, that seems like a very good explanation. Sorry, yeah.
I wonder why, or I wonder if something would change, because now we're working for many years against this.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder what would change if we would rethink our education. I mean, in the ways of how do we as women educate that means boys. And also I would like to point out the role of the men as fathers. So if we are, as women are always looking up to our fathers and have good or bad relationship, whatever, this also, I suppose, influences our power in future time to stand up or don't be afraid to take masculine attributes to get into such positions, whatever. Because we have been discussing yesterday, what is masculine, what is feminine. Yeah, I think this is a question what usually we don't discuss as women, but also responsibility of men. What is our responsibility when we educate our children? Because this is where you put on the lines to what kind of ideal you present to your children. And if it's shared, there must be something changing. I don't believe it's not changed.
Now about this what is masculine, what is feminine. In an audience like this, we can long discuss about what is masculine and what is feminine, but what they do in social research, they ask questions such as list what kind of attributes are associated with women in your culture. So they ask people about the stereotypes that are alive in their culture, and that's how they come up with these with what is seen as masculine and as feminine. So in individual cases, you can start discussing whether emotionality is that really something that women have more than men. Well, it seems that in most cultures in the world, people think that. So even if we don't think that, that is the stereotype that is out there. And that's the way I have been using feminine and masculine. But
thinking already of asking such a question stimulates thinking in stereotypes, and I think that is also what I have a problem with, is this dualistic thinking between men and women. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm very happy of the image of the city you presented. It's as a both male and a female entity.
Yeah.
And maybe that could be a model.
Well, that's a very important remark, of course, but it's like there is also discussion about in the States they have all these checklists that you have to identify: are you white, are you Caucasian, African American, Asian American, whatever. You have to tick boxes. Here, supposedly, this is not important, so we never tick that kind of box. On the other hand, because we don't tick boxes, we don't know how bad it is. We have all kinds of empirical evidence about how, for example, people with a migrant background are not doing so well on the labor market. But once they are Belgian, they disappear from the statistics, so we don't know how long that these effects linger, things like that. So it's stereotyping, yes, but on the other hand, if you don't name it, you are blind for the phenomenon. So
it's good to see the exchange.
Yeah.
I like that, and it's very prevalent in your presentation too. But I feel slightly uncomfortable always.
No, many people feel slightly uncomfortable, and that's a reaction I've had more, that people say, yeah, but they feel...
That's exactly.
Maybe you should feel uncomfortable.
I don't mean that. I don't mean that I feel uncomfortable with your presentation. I feel uncomfortable with this dualistic thinking. That just makes me.
Yeah, but of course we could make it much more complex by also, for example, bringing in lesbians and homosexuals and and other kind of sexualities, and how people. There is also a problem with how in public space homosexual couples cannot really conduct themselves like other heterosexual couples can. So you can also bring in this kind of thing. Yeah, I only had half an hour, so yeah. Yeah. Yes, please.
We've been discussing about neoliberal and these sort of new labor formations that are coming out. And I have a lot of these imageries of the thing that you said, women have moved out of the factory and now inside homes and domestic life. We've seen a lot of social projects. Women collectives become quite energized and active in some kind of reproductive labor. I'm just curious, do you see this movement back to the factory, or is it another kind of arrangement altogether? And how does it play along with neoliberal politics?
Yeah, there are a lot of questions in one. One of the things that I think is important is that somehow in educating our daughters, we have to change a little bit the stereotypes. We have to make our daughters and ourselves more outspoken, more assertive, more self-centered, more competitive. I mean, this is why, for example, also in design and architecture, there are a lot of female designers and architects. They never, it's only exceptionally that they reach the top. I'm convinced that one of the reasons why on the top level, for example, Pritzker Prize winners, you only have 2 women out of 40 winners. At the top level, the reason, a lot of things contribute to that situation, but one of them certainly is that in a culture like ours, if you don't ask attention, if you are not self-centered, if you are not convinced of yourself, I am the best, people need to look at me, people won't look at you. So, and women are socialized to be team players, to take care of one another, to socialize, to be social, to not say I am the best. Hence, they are skipped over when it comes to giving prizes, when it comes to writing articles about them, and so on. This is one of the things where the feminine value of being not so outspoken and not so assertive and not so egocentric and putting the team before yourself has a backlash. It has the effect that indeed women who do that, they do not become visible. Men tend to do that far less. I have this experience of talking to people, for example, on radio programs or television programs who are interviewing scientists and researchers. And they tell me typically we are looking for women. We take the phone, we call up a woman. She says, well, the question you're asking me, you know this is really not my expertise. My colleague can answer your questions better than I. She refers to a male colleague. Never happens with men. They sometimes say, well, it's not really my expertise, but you know, I'll do it. Yeah. So that's typically a difference that in everyday life is not so kind of incredibly obvious, but that in the long run makes a lot of difference and makes that these women who always say my colleague knows better than I, they won't get a prize, they won't get written about, they won't become visible. So that's one thing. Okay, so but that becoming visible is of course part of the neoliberal economy. So that's well, here I really think that the neoliberal economy is this. You have masculine dominance in the 3 spheres, and then this sphere is taken over the others. So I think we need to become to have, first of all, a more inclusive idea of develop more inclusive ideas about economy and what really is making up the national product, taking into account the reproductive work of mainly women. So trying to think about that in another way, but also in these other sectors, I think we should reclaim more autonomy for the world of art and culture and for politics. But how to do that? Because this economics has brought us quite far. We should not be. We have had a lot of progress, incredible progress, in fact. We still have, of course, wars, and there are terrible things happening, and climate change is probably the most important. No, my scientist colleagues tell me not climate change, the lack of biodiversity, that's the main problem, that so many species are dying out. Well, okay, so this dominance of economy has brought us very, very far. If you compare the current situation in the world with the situation 100 years ago, well, you cannot believe the progress. It's really, really, really very, there, for example, in terms of food, we almost have no food crisis anymore. People who have food shortage is really going down. We now have the other problem, too many people eating too rich and becoming too fat and so on. That's now the problem. But the problem of the very regular food shortages and crises, and the problem that we did not produce worldwide enough food to feed everybody, that's almost over and done with. So poverty is still there, but poverty, of course, relative poverty is still, like in a country like Belgium, it's 12-15%, that's a lot, but it's relative poverty. It means that people that their incomes are less than a certain percentage of the median income, but most of them are not living on the streets. Their children can go to school, they do have food, not the best food, they do have so it's compared to what it was 100 and 200 years ago, yeah, we have improved a lot. So this economy has done major things, and this technology. It has brought us really somewhere. But I do think that we need to work hard to make sure that what is happening is that the economy is so dominant that the whole idea of caring for the environment and the earth and for ecology, which I associate with the more feminine logic of caring. So that's feminist ecology, if you want. Our ecological feminism, that this is one of the things that got no attention. So a lot of work needs to be done. I'm not so sure that neoliberal will continue to be the main force. I'm not sure, but yeah, it's crucial to organize resistance. Yeah. Sorry.
I'm just wondering to what extent the numbers that you showed are still correct if you don't include the digital sphere, because a lot of the labor that is actually done nowadays is done from the houses for domestic labor, and it is actually part of the economy.
These are recent figures, huh?
Yeah.
These are very. This is the slide you're referring to?
2013.
Yeah, the other one.
So the other one was 2004, yeah. But it didn't change that much. This was from an article in the newspaper that was quite positive, saying, look, women's work in domestic sphere goes down and men's goes up, and women's work for children goes down and men's goes up.
I'm
but
talking specifically about, for instance, companies that are started by women. Actually, the digital sphere, you're able to be anonymous also. To what extent is the gender discussion still changing because of the digital sphere? And how
well, I must say I don't know. Probably there is research about that. I'm not familiar with it. But my estimate is that at this moment it's still, in terms of the whole workforce, it's minimal. So it might be less than 1% of people doing that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think you go to Silicon Valley and it's what it's saying.
No,
I
it's-
don't know. Yeah.
I just recently read an article that hacker culture, it's like 80% is male, it's very gender.
Yeah, yeah.
But I'm wondering what kind of other research there is on that, because I
Probably
find
there
it
is
very
research, but I'm
interesting.
sorry that I'm not familiar with. Yes, please.
I would be interested, are there any research done about the gender use of public space nowadays in, for example, in Brussels, because, or in other cities of Belgium, or other known cities, because I think this is extremely interesting, facing the migrational mess which is happening at the moment, and also the problematical field that some people say or are afraid, okay, so many men are coming with different culture coming, and even our culture is not using the possibilities of women to be present in the public space. So what would happen? Is there a change, or I mean, Belgium has a lot of colonies, so it's a totally different aspect. For example, than to Austria. We had much less migrants or organized migrants till now. This is a topic which would be very interesting for me if there is some research done on that.
Well, I would love to say yes to your question, and I would love to do this type of research with my doctoral students. But as far the few times that we applied for it, we didn't get funding. But for example, there is a lot of data and research with respect to mobility. So it's clear, for example, women are using public transport much more than men. Men drive more their cars than women do. Women have almost as many cars as men have, but they drive less distances and with more stops. And they have the smaller cars in the family. So that kind of data is there, but the kind of research that Alessandra Gola did about how do people perceive public space, there is not much research there, I'm afraid. Sita Lowe is doing that kind of research in several places, but has not been working in Belgium. She's an anthropologist, a spatial anthropologist.
Rappaport also has some theories, Rappaport.
Amos Rappaport.
Yeah,
Yeah.
about the range of also migrant females and males. That females are much more bound to their local
Who is it?
environments.
Sorry.
Where are you?
Rappaport.
Oh, same.
Yeah.
I have one question. You mentioned somewhere that the violence happens mostly at home, domestic violence, and the streets are innocent safe. So could it be seen that, I mean, I live in Africa, so I can tell you that the streets are very different there than they are here. For white women, because there I'm in the spotlight. The walking ATM machine basically in a female's home, so that's actually the most targeted audience to be said on the streets, which of course dictates where and when I walk and it's not really an option, you learn where you're supposed to go and where not. But the point I was trying to make here is that if the domestic violence is the biggest challenge for women, then women can invite who they take to their homes. So isn't actually the responsibility to start with, rather than referring to, of course you need to have the reference books, but just by your own action, as a woman to take action.
Yeah, but don't forget that there is also incest, there is also young girls that are raped by, and it was not by coincidence that I was mentioning the uncle, but it does exist, It does exist, so this idea of home as the place of peace, what Ruskin was saying, home is the space of peace. That's for men true, but less for women. Well, but at the same time, I didn't go into the statistics, so I'm not familiar with current figures, so I shouldn't claim too much.
Thank you.
Thank you.